Last alive after the Stagecoach Massacre, a cowboy lifted her up and gave her a home. The wheel was still turning when I got there. Just the one wheel up in the air, still spinning slow on its axle like it didn't know yet what had happened. The coach was on its side in the ravine. 2 horses dead in the traces. The third had torn loose and was somewhere in the pines above me. I could hear it, that hollow knock of hooves on frozen ground, running and not knowing where to run to. I didn't go to the coach right away. I stood there a moment with my hand on my rifle and listened, whined out of the northwest, magpies working something on the far ridge. Whoever had done this was gone, that much I could tell from the quiet. The driver was dead across the box. The guard, too, slumped against the wheel that was still turning. 3 passengers inside when I pulled open the door. 2 men, a woman. The men were dead. The woman was not. She was pressed into the far corner of the overturned coach, her back flat against what had been the roof and was now the floor, her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself. She had dark hair, most of it come loose, and a cut across her cheek that had bled down into her collar. Her eyes were open. That was about all I could say for certain. Her eyes were open and she was breathing. I said something, I don't remember what, something stupid probably, something about being all right, which was plainly a lie. She didn't move. I climbed down into the coach and crouched there in that cold, tilted dark, and I spoke to her quiet the way you'd speak to a horse that's been startled bad. I told her I was going to get her out. I told her she could take whatever time she needed, but that we couldn't stay here. I told her my name. Del Harker. I don't know why I told her that. Seemed like the right thing, something true to anchor to. Her name, I found out later, was Marta Voss. She had come from somewhere in the East, not American East, the other East, over the water. She had a brother in the territory who had sent for her. The letter that told her how to find him was still folded in her coat pocket, which I thought about later, in quiet moments, because that letter was the only thing that hadn't been taken from her. But that was later. Right then, she was just a woman alive in a dead coach in a ravine in November. And I was a man who happened to be passing on the way back to my place from Weller's Trading, post with a sack of flour on my pack mule, and no particular plans beyond getting home before the light went. I got her out. It took a while. She couldn't seem to make her legs work right, not from injury but from something else, something that had gone rigid inside her. I half lifted her, half steadied her, and we got up out of that tilted door and into the cold, and she stood there in the gravel of the ravine floor and looked at the coach and the horses and the men, and she didn't make a sound. Not one. I brought my horse down. She looked at it like she'd forgotten what a horse was. I said we needed to move. I said we had maybe 2 hours of light and my place was 40 minutes northeast. I said there was a stove and a roof and she could decide what to do next once we were there. She looked at me then, really looked at me, took me in, I suppose. Weathered old face, 40 years of sun and wind and dust and cold. A coat that had been repaired more than once, nothing much to recommend me. But she must have decided something, because she put her foot in the stirrup and let me boost her up, and she sat there and held the pommel and didn't say a word for the whole 40 minutes. I want to be clear about what my place was. It was not much. 1-room cabin, solid enough, the logs chinked and rechinked, and the roof I'd reshingled myself 2 summers before. A lean-to on the back for the horse and the mule. A root cellar that stayed cold enough through winter. A stove that drew well once you learned its tempers, which took most people a season. A table, 2 chairs, a rope bed in the corner, a shelf of the books I'd had since before and never got rid of. That's what I had. That's what she got. I got the stove going. I gave her a cloth for her face, and she cleaned the cut herself, carefully, looking at nothing in particular. I put water on for coffee, and I fried salt pork and cut bread, and I set it on the table, and I said eat, and she did. Not like she was hungry, more like a task she was performing because someone had said to. I slept that night on the floor by the stove. I rolled out my bedroll and told her the bed was hers, and I didn't wait for an argument. She slept 12 hours. I know because I was awake most of them, which is nothing new for me, has never been new since the war, but that night I was awake and listening in a different way. Making sure she was still breathing, making sure nobody came. Nobody came. In the morning, she said 2 things. She said, "Thank you," with her accent that clipped the words short and clean. And she said, "I need to find my brother." I told her I knew where the Voss claim was. I'd ridden past it. About 14 miles south and west, in the river bottom, A homestead claim a man named Carl Voss had been working since the spring. I said I'd take her there once the weather held. The weather did not hold. The snow came 3 days later, and it came hard, the kind that packs fast and drifts across the doorway and kills the weak stock if you're not on top of it. I was on top of it. I'd been doing this long enough. She watched me work. That first storm, she just stood in the doorway of the linta wrapped in a blanket I'd given her, and she watched me break the ice on the water trough and haul extra hay and check the mule's feet. She didn't offer to help. I don't think it occurred to her. She was still somewhere else, somewhere back in that ravine. But she watched. By the second storm, she was helping. I don't know when exactly that shifted. I just looked up one afternoon and she was there beside me, doing what needed doing, figuring out from watching what was wanted. She wasn't asking permission. She was just working. She was stronger than she looked. I'd guessed that from the way she'd climbed out of the ravine, the way she'd done it without falling apart, but out here in the cold and the mud she proved it. She hauled water. She split kindling. She learned the stove's tempers faster than I had. Inside a week, she was banking the fire for the night better than I'd ever managed it. She cooked things I didn't know how to cook. She found herbs in my supply shelf I'd forgotten I had, and she used them, and the food was different. Better. There was a flavor to it I couldn't name. She didn't talk much. Neither did I. That suited us both, I think, though I kept catching myself listening for her, the sound of her moving around the cabin, the knock of the kettle being set back on the stove, the particular way she hummed very quietly when she thought I wasn't listening, just a few notes, no tune I recognized, more like a habit than a song. I did not think about what this arrangement looked like from outside. I did not think about what people would say. I had stopped caring what people said about me some years back, after Helen died and I kept on working and the neighbors kept on pitying me, and eventually the pity dried up and the distance set in, and by now I was just the man who worked the Harker place up on the North Fork, spoke when spoken to, did his business in town, and went home. I was not a subject of much interest. I had made my peace with that. It is a particular kind of loneliness, that peace. You get used to it. You mistake it for contentment sometimes. It fills the space where something else was. We got word about Carl Voss in December. One of Weller's men came through with a message. Carl Voss had taken sick in the fall, pneumonia, and he had not recovered. He was buried on his own claim. His homestead was in dispute. He had debt against it, and the men he owed were pressing the county to settle. I was the one who told her. She was at the table when I came in. She looked up when I came through the door. Something in my face told her before I said a word, because her face went very still in that way it had, that bracing stillness I recognized now. I told her flat. No soft cushioning, no circling around it. She had come all this way, and her brother was dead, and the land he'd meant to give her a stake on was lost, and there was nothing there for her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in a voice that was very even, "I have nowhere to go." It wasn't a question. It wasn't self-pity. It was just a fact she was stating out loud, the way you'd note the temperature or the state of the road. A practical woman tallying what she had. I said, "You've got here." She looked at me. I said it again, plainer. I said she didn't have to go anywhere. I said the place was small, but it was solid, and it was hers to stay in if she wanted, and I was not asking anything from her except that she think on it before she made up her mind. She thought on it for about 30 seconds. She said, "All right." That was the whole of that conversation. I went back out to check the mule's water, and she went back to whatever she'd been doing, but something had settled. Something that had been open and uncertain had closed into a shape. I felt it, and I thought she did too. January was the hardest month. The cold that came in the second week of January was a different kind of cold from the storms, dry and still, and so deep it felt like the world had stopped. The horse's breath in the linta froze in the air. The water in the bucket inside the cabin had a skin of ice on it some mornings. You burn twice the wood and do twice the work, and the cold doesn't care. I got sick. I'm not someone who gets sick. In 40-some years, I'd had 2 fevers bad enough to put me down, and both of them were after the war, when I was young enough to burn through it. This one came on fast. One evening I was fine. The next morning I couldn't stand without the room tilting. Chest rattling, head heavy. A cold sweat that was somehow both cold and burning at once. I don't remember much of the first day. I was on the bed, she got me there somehow. I don't recall how. I'm heavier than I look, and she's not a large woman, but apparently she managed. I drifted in and out. At some point there was broth. At some point there was a wet cloth on my head. At some point she was sitting beside the bed in one of the chairs and she was reading from one of the books on the shelf, out loud, quietly, and I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it was good. Steady. Something to hold to. I was afraid I was going to die. Not the dramatic kind of afraid. Just the practical kind, the recognition that men die of things like this. Alone in winter. And I had been doing it alone for a long time, and here I was not doing it alone. And for a moment that seemed like the most remarkable thing in the world, which tells you how sick I was. The fever broke the third night. I came back to myself with the cabin dark except for the stove glow and her asleep in the chair beside me, her head against her hand, her hair loose. I lay there and looked at her for a while. She'd taken my coat off the peg and put it around her shoulders like a blanket. I thought she stayed. Not a complicated thought. She could have gone to town. She could have gotten to Weller's and found help and left me here. She'd stayed. Fed the horses, kept the fire, sat beside me in the dark and read out loud from a book she could barely follow. I thought nobody has done that, not in a long time. In the morning she woke and found me watching her, and she was startled, and then she said, in that flat, careful way she had, "You look better." I said I felt better. She said good. She stood and went to the stove. After a while she said, without looking at me, I was worried. Just those 3 words, nothing else. But the way she said them, level, plain, like an admission she'd been holding back and decided to let out, I understood what they meant. She hadn't just stayed. She'd been afraid for me. I said I appreciated it. She handed me a cup of coffee without looking at me, and that was the end of that. But I held the cup in both hands in that freezing cabin, and the warmth of it went right through me, and I thought about those 3 words for the rest of the day. Spring came late, and it came muddy. There was fence to run. The south pasture had lost 2 posts to frost heave, and the wire had gone slack, and a section needed resetting before I could put the cattle out. I was out there one morning in the muck, tamping a post, when I looked up and she was coming across the field with a pail. She'd made something, a kind of tea, hot, from dried things she'd found in the herb shelf. She handed it to me across the half-set post, and I took it, and she looked at the fence line with her head tilted in that way she had when she was thinking. She said, 3 more posts that way are bad. I said I knew. She said, I can hold the wire while you tamp. I said I was managing. She looked at me just for a moment, the kind of look that doesn't argue, it just waits. I said, all right. She held the wire. She had good hands for it, not afraid of the barbs, knew how to grip without cutting herself, kept steady tension while I drove the posts. We worked our way down the fence line in the mud and the thin spring sun, and she didn't talk, and I didn't talk, and by noon we had everything set that needed setting and the cattle could go out tomorrow. I don't know how to explain what that meant to me, to have someone there who could see what needed doing and did it, who didn't need to be asked, who didn't need to be thanked, who just showed up in the mud with a pail and held the wire. I had worked alone for 9 years. Since Helen. 9 years of doing everything myself, planning for one, thinking for one, deciding for one. And here was this woman from somewhere across an ocean who had survived something I didn't want to think about too hard, who had lost everything she'd come here for, and who was out in the mud holding fence wire because it needed holding. There are things you don't know you're missing until they come back. Summer opened up the country. The grass came in green and then went gold, and the cattle moved well, and the hay was good. I hired on a boy from town for the cutting, and he came out 3 days a week, and he was polite and quiet, and the second week he was there I watched him watching Marta, trying to figure out what the situation was, because the territory does not accommodate ambiguity gracefully, and he needed to know whose place this was and what she was to me. I had not thought about that until I saw him wondering it. I went into supper that evening, and she put food on the table and sat across from me, and I looked at the table and not at her, and I said, I need to ask you something. She said, all right. I said I wanted to ask her to marry me. She said nothing. I said I knew it was not romantic. I said I knew she had come here for something else, and this was not what she'd planned, and I was not a young man, and the place was not much, and she had every right to say no, and I would not make it awkward between us. I said I just thought it was the right thing to put plainly. She said, why do you want to? I thought about it. I said because she was the best person I'd been around in a long time, and I thought we did well together, and I had a lot of years of work left in me, and I would rather do them with her than without. She was quiet. I looked up. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before on her. Not the careful watchfulness she usually wore. The thing I'd come to understand was not coldness but a kind of protective attention, the face of a woman who had been startled too many times and learned to keep a wall up. This was different, softer, like something at ease that had been braced a long time. She said, "I think you are a good man, Del Harker." I said I didn't know about that. She said, "I do." Then she said, "Yes, if you want me, yes." I had not been prepared for how much those words would do to me. 9 years alone, and before that years of just going through the motions, working, surviving, not expecting much. And here was this woman from across the world saying yes, she would have me, and the thing that hit me hardest was the last part, "if you want me." As though she was still not entirely sure. As though the idea of being wanted by someone was something she needed to check on. I said, "I want you." She nodded once, decisive. She said, "Good, then eat before it gets cold." We married in August in town at the courthouse, with Weller and his wife as witnesses and the boy from town waiting outside because he'd driven us in. It took about 10 minutes. Marta wore her good dress and she had done something with her hair, and she was standing there in that plain little room with the judge reading from his paper and the light coming through the dusty window, the most real thing I'd seen in years. I mean that in a particular way. After Helen died, everything went a little unreal. You keep moving, you keep working, the days go by and they're real enough in the sense that you can touch them and they have weather and weight. But there's nothing behind them. They're just days. She had brought the behind back. The judge said the words. I said the words. She said the words. The judge shook my hand and patted hers, and Weller slapped me on the arm, and his wife cried a little, which I hadn't expected, and then we drove back, and that was that. On the drive back, she sat beside me on the wagon seat, and after a while she put her hand through my arm. Just left it there. Her hand through my arm, and the horse moving easy on the summer road, and the hills going gold in the evening light. I held my arm close against my side, so her hand would stay put. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. Word got around. The territory does not have much to talk about, and so when something happens, even something small like a man who's been alone 9 years getting himself remarried to a foreign woman who'd survived a stagecoach massacre, it becomes a thing people talk about. By September, most of the ranchers in the valley knew about it. By October, some of them had come by. I had not expected them to come. I had been not welcome in the valley for long enough that I'd stopped thinking about it. After Helen died, I had not managed the social requirements. I hadn't been to the right gatherings, hadn't put in at the right times, hadn't greased the right wheels, and men who have land and cattle are territorial about their standing, and if you don't tend it, you lose it, and I had let mine go. I was the man on the North Fork, civil enough, not much else. But they came. The Brennan brothers came first with a haunch of venison because one of them had got a big buck and they always brought a share around. That was their custom. And Marta fed them coffee and they sat at my table, and they talked about the range and the weather, and they looked around my cabin and at Marta and at me, and I could see something shifting in how they held themselves around me. Something careful. Something like respect, working its way back in after a long absence. Then the Kohler family, 3 of them with a cake of all things, because Mrs. Kohler baked when she had occasion, and she had decided this was an occasion. She and Marta sat at the table and talked. I don't know how much they understood each other, but they seemed to manage. And old man Kohler pulled me outside and talked to me about cattle prices for half an hour with a seriousness that told me he had decided I was worth talking to again. Then Alderman Pierce from town, who had not spoken to me voluntarily in 4 years because of a boundary dispute that had never been properly resolved. And he came out himself on a Tuesday morning, and he shook my hand, and he said he'd heard I was doing well, and he was glad to hear it. And we stood on the porch, and I had the feeling that the boundary dispute had been quietly folded and put away. I don't know what she did. I don't know what she said to people or how she managed it. She was not a woman who maneuvered or schemed. That was not in her nature. But there was something about her, a straightness to how she met people that seemed to make them straighter too. She looked at a man and took him serious, and he found himself wanting to be worth it. She had done that to me. Maybe she just did it to everyone. Winter came again. The second winter is the one you trust. You know the place by then. You know where the drafts come in and where the stove throws heat and which corner of the linta stays warmest and how many cords of wood you need, and when to start worrying about the horses. I knew all that. Now she knew it too. One night in late November, I came in from checking the stock in weather that had gone mean, sleet, the kind that comes sideways. And I was cold through, and she had the fire built up high and water hot, and she handed me a towel and took my coat and hung it by the stove and went back to what she was doing without a word. I sat at the table and wrapped my hands around the cup she'd left out for me, and I watched her at the stove, her back to me, her hair pinned up the way she wore it in the evenings. The lamp was on, and the stove was throwing light, and outside the sleet was coming down, and I was inside and warm. I had been cold for 9 years. Not just the physical cold, though that too, there is a cold that lives in an empty house under the skin of it that no stove fixes. I had been cold since Helen and I had gone practical about it and told myself that was fine, that was how it went, that I had everything I needed and wanting more was foolish. I had been wrong about that. She turned around and saw me looking at her, and she raised an eyebrow. I said, I'm grateful. She said, for what? I said, for all of it, for staying, for being here. She looked at me, that look again. The one I had learned was her version of an open face, something she didn't show easily and didn't show to everyone. She came over. She stood beside my chair and she put her hand on the back of my neck, just rested it there, warm and steady, and she said quietly, where would I go? Not where would I go, she meant where would she want to go. She meant there was nowhere, she meant this was it. I reached up and covered her hand with mine. We stayed like that a moment, her hand on the back of my neck, my hand over hers, the sleet on the roof and the fire going and the lamp burning and the whole rest of the world somewhere far outside. Just us and the warm and the weight of her hand. She said, come eat. I said, all right. She went back to the stove and I got up and washed my hands at the basin and sat back down at the table and she brought the food over and we ate. We talked a little about the cattle, about the fence line that needed work in the spring, about something she'd heard from Mrs. Kohler the week before. Ordinary things. The ordinary things that accumulate into a life. After supper, I sat with one of the books from the shelf, and she sat across from me with the mending, and the fire went low, and the lamp began to smoke a little, and neither of us moved to fix it right away. Just sat there in the dimming light, her head bent over her work, her breath slow and steady, alive. Outside, the sleet had gone to snow. It came down silent, the way it does when it means to stay, and it put a thick white quiet over the North Fork and the pasture and the road and the hills. And in the morning everything would be covered and the work would begin again and I would be here to do it. That is all I have to tell you. A woman got out of a dead coach in November and a man brought her home, and that is the whole of the story. Except the whole of the story took a lifetime to understand, and I am still in the middle of it, and that is fine. That is better than fine. The fire's low, I ought to bank it for the night. She's already asleep.